what I thought I would try to do today is to finish this up by addressing three questions which my reflections on these discussions provoked in me. That is, problems with what I think I've been trying to do. And I'm going to also try to answer those problems somewhat lamely, but to highlight the difficulties implicit in this line of thought, and then to use that direction to reach the announced topic of today, that is, do we terminate? And that will come appropriately at the end. I try to give what I think are the main features of the question, do we terminate? As you would suspect, I feel that we've been in the grip, as usual, of a set of cliches which have sort of given us routine procedures which are more or less adaptive to some situations, but seldom very adaptive to many. Now, the three questions that arose in my thinking about the line of this effort have been, first, how did we get from the concept of perspective and working with perspectives, the collision of perspectives, how do we get from that centering on essentially a psychological problem, that is the problem of how we see things and how we relate to the way other people see things, how do we get from that to the concept of the real? Is there a compelling justification for making that what I referred to once as a kind of oxymoronic jump that's implicit in going from a psychological concern to something which lies outside of psychology, perhaps, or at least lies outside of the concept of perspective. That is the notion of a psychologically real. And that's a very, for me, that's a very difficult question to answer, except in practical terms. But out of the practical terms, we have to generate some kind, it seems to me, some kind of way of thinking about the psychologically real, which escapes mysticism or ad hoc phenomena. And then the second problem that I have with myself in these discussions is how do we go from the search for the real to what was one of the main drifts of the last discussion, that is, to the search for those factors which are effective in our work, in what we work with, what others have called two common factors. How do we go from perspective to real to the psychotherapeutic, to the best documented psychotherapeutic powers, you would say? How do we do that? We don't like common factors, which has been used in a demeaning way, really, often called non-specific factors. If we don't like that, maybe we'll dignify it or attempt to dignify it by calling them therapeutic principles or something of that kind. And I don't need to remind you that the main source of our ideas, psychoanalytic theory, the main source of our ideas has been remarkably parsimonious in providing us with therapeutic principles. It was never an interest of Freud's in the first place. And in fact, I think there's extensive evidence from his comments that he regarded therapy as interfering with his scientific enterprise, however much it made it possible. So that analysis has hobbled along on the basis of a few comments about the importance of transference, working through and bringing reason, the persistent voice of reason, to the problem of irrationality. Various things which those of us here and elsewhere who work on this problem realize are a rubber crutch. And then finally, the third question, which haven't addressed, but I'll try to, which is also presents problems, is how do we go from this position for perspective to the real, to the common factors, to the idea of ending, completing. And we don't when we use the word termination, we don't mean finishing. That is not the tone or even the practical implication of the word termination. The finishing is a medical term. We finish the operation, we finish the treatment. We've gotten through this episode. That's the notion in medicine. No one expects the patient not to return to some doctor, some surgeon, at least to the undertaker, right? No one expects that not to transpire. But there's a notion in termination of something very final, and we all know that is rendered in the everyday even boast. I had a successful analysis. It's over now, right? And even though Freud would be the last to think there was much to that, he certainly didn't disabuse people sharply of it. Even though when he was invited to a conference once, which the title of which was "How Does Psychoanalysis Cure?" Notice the word was cure. How does psychoanalysis cure? He's supposed to have said upon entering it, ask someone, does it? So I want those three questions to guide this discussion. And the first and probably the most difficult is the question of how we get from a psychological viewpoint, that is a perspective, to the real. As I say, it's easy to answer in a practical way, because when I said about understanding your perspective, for example, it said about respecting your perspective, right? Then I find out that you don't respect it. In fact, that you demean it even. Sometimes, perhaps. Many times in certain cases. Perhaps exclusively in other cases. Or perhaps I find out that there's some large sense in which you disavow your perspective, the way you look at life, in which you are trying to move beyond it. And one meets that in many different forms. I suppose one of the most prominent is the concept of a midlife crisis. But in all phases of life, one sees people's perspective shaken, right? The most dramatic examples, I suppose, are the concept of the imposter. Someone who takes up a view of the world or position in the world, which sometimes includes a perspective, that is distinctly not their own, or is for convenience. How does the concept of false personality or character armor, how does it get into our thinking? What makes it compelling? I mean, it is on a casual basis, certainly winning at least. And but how does it come to grip us so strongly, as is true today? And as I say, it is not a concept that I think you can find in Freud, at least in a major way, and you can find almost everything in Freud, but I don't see it, and some of you better scholars than I could perhaps feel it there. One does see it come, really charging in with Wilhelm Reich. And the whole idea of false identifications, of imposed parts of the so-called neurotic phantom, this comes in a way that is psychologically convincing to us very early. But you could hear, if there was, and maybe there is somewhere tucked away, if one could hear a debate between Reich and Freud on this issue, I could imagine some of the ways it might go. Reich saying, well, can't you see it? Can't you feel it? Can't you even date its onset? For example, in certain kinds of identifications occurring that he described in character analysis. And Freud responding, yes, but that's always the way it is. It's always an identification, an interjection. It's never complete. These are defensive processes in part. What did you expect? And so you describe, Freud continues to Reich perhaps, so you describe some interjections, some identifications that are conflictual, that make the armor clank. Well, that's true of all psychic life. All I've done, he could say, is point out to you the clankings, the conflicts, as he called them, between impulse and defense, or between impulse and impulse, between identification and identification. So what are you telling me? I could imagine him saying, by insisting so much upon these particular identifications. And I think he would also add that there is implicit in your view of personality a moral stance that Freud might, at least in certain respects, abjure. That he's saying that there's a right way to do it. There's a more harmonious personality. But who's to say whether harmonious personalities are good? You can certainly think of a lot of examples of where they aren't, and where unharmonious ones have been extraordinarily useful, good, helpful. So this issue of whether we can really talk about true and false, real and unreal, is in my mind at least very much unsettled. Now it comes into us in another way too. And here it partakes, I think, of a richer tradition than, a different tradition than the clinical one. It partakes here of a religious spiritual tradition, which eventually becomes a philosophical tradition, if I read things right, in which one can see the saint, asking himself or herself whether the saint is true to God, faithful to the message of the divine one, and that we answer to something. Is I don't know where it starts, but if you read Cassira's accounts of the origins of language and religion, you don't see the question appearing because there's nothing apart from me to answer, because I am it. There is a primordial oneness that allows me not to answer to anything. And that's a later event as I separate myself out from the Godhead or whatever. But that separation occurs, and then the question of answering to comes in more and more strongly. And not just answering to, I think it's fair to say that there's a body of evidence that suggests that we don't just answer to, we obey. Our movements are dictated. And those of you any of you who share my interest in Julian Jaynes's contention, for example, know that he believes that mental life was organized for a very long time in a posture of obedience, and that you can easily see how that could be a stage in Cassira's a stage beyond the primordial one, to where there is gradually emerging an independent self, and that he suggests, as you know, certain neurophysiological parallels to that change, perhaps. In any case, this tradition of answering to something is are you true to God, or are you then true to society, or are you true to your internalized prohibitions, as in the superego discussion. The idea that I have, rested some weight on through this comes from the still later tradition, at least I see it as later, perhaps you could better identify its origins, the still later tradition that eventually this separation, first from God and then from society, ends in a tiny moment, in a tiny spot, you might say, in which I answer to myself. I answer to myself. I mentioned, I suppose the 20th century figure. I'm sure many of you are better equipped to answer that large statement. But I think the 20th century figure that most persistently, certainly most famously, embodies that pointedness is Heidegger. And for all his sordid connections with Nazism and his curious personality, which, by the way, is interestingly discussed in this correspondence between Jaspers and Hannah Arendt, both of whom were very taken with him, with both of whom were very puzzled by him. A chilling account of that, I think, basically chilling man. Nevertheless, if you go into the libraries or go into the bookstores, I don't know whether there's anybody who's more referred to or more thought about or more written about than Martin Heidegger. But he brings us, if I read him right, and that's questionable, certainly, he brings us to this point of the self answering to the self, within this compass of internal dialogue. Not I and thou, but I and I. And I don't think there'd be any reason for me to embroil myself in such, what often to me, arcane matters, if it weren't that this question is over and over again, at least today, in the practice I have and in the patients that I hear about, an everyday matter. So that what he represents in his extraordinary language is I don't know anybody whose language is more extraordinary in some ways than Heidegger's. I mean, both for its awfulness and for its curious faithfulness to phenomena. You could spend a lifetime trying to figure out what's going on in that language, and you'd need to know a great deal more German than I do. Anyway, but it isn't because the patients have read Heidegger. I don't believe that. And no more than all the patients have read Freud, although that's a much more likely phenomenon as a distortion of our practice. But I don't think they've read Heidegger. But they talk like Heidegger. That's the point. And of course Heidegger would say, well, that's because I know how it is. I've been there myself. And you can I think that's a claim I would at least say was open to some curious, not affirmation, but certainly respect. So there it is. They come to us, these patients. We say to ourselves, it's an everyday thing, Where am I answering now my call, my own call? And all about us, of course, people are saying that's exactly where the world has gone wrong, isn't it? We're exactly where the world has gone wrong. We've given up the respect for God or even the respect for social norms as we go about our so-called atomistic ways. And that's a very powerful criticism of our work, much of our work. Can you really answer the critics, for example, of the right wing in our own political spectrum, who say to us that you people don't know what you're doing, and you don't realize that human beings are dangerous reptilian creatures that, if not reined within, fundamental principles of right, acceded to by all, so claimed. If you don't do that, then you have a world which dissolves in chaos, where people are murdered on the streets. And they look around at the modern world, even the richest country in the world, and see that happening. So they, it's not something we can dismiss as old-fashioned hogwash, especially if we come from the Freudian tradition. Because no one was more suspicious of human nature than Freud. I mean, his indifference to patients, or really his regarding them, many of them as trash, a word he liked to use, was based not only upon perhaps on his scientific interests, but also on his observations of human nature. We're not a pretty species. We didn't get to be number one because we treated each other with love and loving kindness. We know better than any species hitherto evolved, except perhaps the viruses, how to really, bludgeoned each other to death. But anyway, I come back in my, again, limping way to hearing that call, and in an everyday way making my living in part off trying to answer that call, finding that call means of fulfillment, or hearing that call more clearly, which of course has been one of the central themes of this. And which brings us again to this word, the real, which we identify, perhaps a little feebly, with this searching for ourselves. I tried to, throughout these discussions, and I'm sure it often struck you as less than fully compelling, I tried to locate the psychologically real in phenomena. I'm not content, and I don't think most clinicians would be, to use the Heideggerian inner call as simply, prima facie evidence of the existence of being. As the genesis of being. And I looked for, and look all the time. I listen. I think I try to listen for what is the closest one comes to this hearing about the person's reality. And you saw how eagerly I seized on both on Oliver Sacks's previous writings and on this recent piece that Faye Middleman let me see for the first time. That is his account of Edelman's neural Darwinism, which is really an effort to see the brain as evolving into a statement, a perspective and a personal statement of its nature. And Oliver Sacks, who's not afraid to use the word soul as the outcome of these neural developments, which no doubt gets him branded a nut in one way or another. But I seize on those things because of the embarrassment of realizing how thin the thinking is, on my part at least, as to how one recognizes this psychological reality. And I remember again how I seized on this Mozartiana book and saw the curious statements of composers and artists about what seemed musically real, humanly real in music. And one can scout around and see other evidences, literatures, You can read James Joyce, for example, as being a long attempt to let the soul speak, And there too we see this phenomena of contradictories constituting the real. I suppose the example that's always stuck in my mind is in Finnegan's Wake, the book, the word he loves to use is laugh tears. Not laughter, but laugh tears. To put together this Mozartian combination of sadness with happiness and vice versa. And then in an effort to go further in this search beyond perspective, individual perspective, to the psychologically real, I suggested a series of very similar, in my mind, methods by which artists and writers and therapists have attempted to get at this, what they sometimes call the psychologically real. And I mentioned Cezanne, and I mentioned with Conrad, some of the Conrad material. I mentioned Binswanger's taking over from Husserl, phenomenological reduction, and and then again I mentioned Freud. And I want to read you from Freud a passage that's well known to you. I don't recall whether I read it here before or not, but it doesn't matter. I need to read it again because I may not have emphasized enough that the passage that follows it, because that sets our problem up nicely. Now this is, as you recall, from the recommendations to physicians for the practice of psychoanalysis. Notice he says for physicians. Interesting. A man who had so little respect for physicians in many ways. I don't understand that except as a political title. And he says here we go. You know this so well. The technique, however, is a simple one. It disclaims the use of any special aids, even of note-taking, and simply consists in making no effort to concentrate the attention on anything in particular, in maintaining in regard to all that one hears the same measure of calm, quiet attentiveness, of evenly hovering attention as I once before described it. In this way, a strain can be more easily born. For as soon as attention is deliberately concentrated in it, in a certain degree, one begins to select from the material before one. One point will be fixed in the mind with particular clearness, and some other consequently disregarded. In this selection, one's expectations or one's inclinations will be followed. This is just what must not be done. If one's expectations are followed in this selection, there is danger of never finding anything but what is already known. And if one follows one's inclinations, anything which is perceived will most certainly be falsified. It must not be forgotten that the meaning of the things one hears is, at all events, for the most part, only recognizable later on. In other places he says, after the treatment is over. Or, it is not a good thing to formulate a case scientifically while treatment is proceeding, to reconstruct its development, anticipate its progress, and take notes from time to time of the condition at the moment, as scientific interest would require, he says. Cases which are thus destined at the start to scientific purposes and treated accordingly suffer in consequence, while the most successful ones are those in which one proceeds as it were aimlessly and allows oneself to be overtaken by any surprises, always presenting to them an open mind, free of any expectations, which is Husserl's phenomenological reduction. So there it is. That's the method he says he attempted to apply. And then, immediately following that passage, he says, however, the time may come when we have learned so much about the nature of unconscious processes and mental processes in general that this will not be necessary. And then he talks about swinging over between a scientific method and a therapeutic method. And at that point, having blurred the distinction, it isn't clear which is scientific and which is therapeutic, except the implication, I think, is that now the scientific method has usurped the therapeutic method. And one now knows what is going on. And one can close down to some measure one's belief. Now that's, he says we haven't gotten there yet, but this is only 1917. Hasn't gotten there yet. And the implication is that you could get there. And the further implication is if you belong to an established canon of thought, there you have gotten there. So that this method is now unnecessary. Well, it's obvious how I feel about that, in that I don't think we've gotten there, and I think there are reasons to think that it is not possible to get there. But that was not his viewpoint. He was not a relativist. He was not a cultural relativist. He didn't think that what he was discovering was simply true of a certain time in Viennese history with a certain population. He thought he was describing the fundamental principles of the mind, and perhaps he was. But that point is crucial for us, and I think perhaps more than any other single point, it represents roads, diverging roads. Now I would argue, and some of you would argue against it, I'm sure, that I would argue that since 1917 and continuing, in fact, the project has not coalesced. It has broadened. It has come to include much more. And that's represented by the many schools of opinion that have emerged. But because they're not merely schools of opinion, they're also schools which study different things, whether it's society or trauma or the self, blah, blah. There's a long list of them. And furthermore, there is a cultural tradition that has serious questions to ask about any finished account of psychological life. Further, there now is an emerging neurological tradition in which the brain is plainly a much more plastic organ than anyone conceived. All those things, as you know, represent for me compelling evidence, or if not compelling, at least the most substantial evidence there is, that this future that he envisaged as possibly happening, where there was a canon of thought which one could simply refer to, has not taken place, and systematically cannot take place, not only because of the complexity of factors and the uniqueness of the individual perspective, but also because of the changing culture and the changing brain. Now, what does that have to do with the real? Why couldn't I say that meant that there was no real? There were only many reals, and to which I would think that is to some large measure true. But notice, I too have a kind of final point, which may be the weaknesses one of the most serious weaknesses in my mentation, is that I think there is a approach one can make to the psychologically real in the individual person. One has at least to has to at least to defer to that possibility in the interests of respect and freedom. But that may be the way in which my finality, my canon, my need for a stopping point, that may be the Achilles heel of this argument. Am I giving that a finality? In other words, it doesn't deserve to have. Well, the second question that I thought I had not done justice to, and probably cannot do full justice to, is this issue of how one gets from the real to the actual therapeutic factors, the common factors, the therapeutic principles, how one makes that move. Now, here I depended very heavily, as you remember, on the concept of repetitions, of the notion of blockages, as being a sign that something was needed to make the movement toward the person's own interests or fulfillment possible. Now that's in practice, that seems to me a good position to take. But again, that's a hard one to not to look at critically. Can you identify a blockage? What Paul Russell likes to call crunches in treatment, where things seem to go nowhere, and where you may be presented with a repetitious factor that is very difficult to surmount. Is that true, or is that simply a function of our despair, of our inability to see how the repetitive behavior is in fact serving something, which it may be? That's a very inviting idea, the idea of repetitions. But in fact, we know that however seemingly repetitive some acts are, they're always at least a little different. And indeed, one in a long treatment, which someone is paying a lot for, in which you feel the need to justify, which God knows is a common experience, a little less now perhaps with shorter treatment. But where that takes place, we are very eager to see in repetitions a sign of movement, only to justify the expense and the trouble in our own, perhaps, inadequacy. But that's often a very hard one to know. And even if the patient is like the patient I discussed with you, someone who was hell-bent for change and identified rather probably too clearly the problem that this woman had, you remember, with the finding someone she could live with and a career that meant something to her. Even there, was she selling her half-hearted lovers short? Had she not followed Nietzsche's hospitality principle to the point where where the toad became a prince, or the princess became a toad, or whatever? I don't know. It's hard to know. And I'm sure you have agonized as much or more than I have about those situations in treatment where the person had to decide whether to stay married or not stay married, or to go for this one or go for that one, or take a chance on this career or that, and you realize how helpless we are to do more than place ourselves with the patient in the dilemma, hoping that will help them to decide. But often it doesn't. But I took the brave step, maybe the foolish step, of suggesting that there are other things we do. And I even made a cheating kind of comparison to the medical situation, where the cardiologist gives the patient the right heart drug, and if the medium of exchange or transmission is adequate, the drug is absorbed and not destroyed, and if it's the right drug, it gets to the right place, and if things are set up right, the action of the heart is improved. That was a winning kind of, notice how the heart gets snuck in there, so that we're ready to hear about the psychological heart and then make these comparisons. That's an inviting metaphor, but it may not be a very accurate one. But I suggested that, when you help people through repetitions to the discovery of what is real for them, you're creating a situation which is very analogous to this heart drug. And then I took a step which I can congratulate myself for the bravery, if perhaps the foolishness as much, but the bravery of, by suggesting that the clearest account of the so-called common factors, the one that comes down to us from Carl Rogers, is a beautiful account of how the medium of transmission is created between patient and therapist. And you remember how I did that. I said that Rogers first wanted a good relationship between doctor and patient, by which was meant both genuine and respectful. I'll come back to this in a moment. The two liked each other, essentially, felt safe with each other. Right? Then the second condition was a step up. That was understanding or empathy. It was not just that they liked each other, but that they understood each other a little. And by understand each other, they meant that their viewpoints
were not only acknowledged to be different, but also overlapped to some extent. I was able to see how you see it, not altogether. Empathy is never more than a very partial event. But I was somehow with you at times, at least. Maybe most of all in those sad times. So that was the number 2. And the third is the most suspect, but I think also perhaps the most important. And that was that not only is our relationship a good one, not only do we understand each other to some extent, but finally I prize you and you prize me. The friendship has been called a mutual admiration society. And there's a lot to that. And a great deal of what's called self-psychology is about the creation, fostering of mutual admiration societies. And and calling it that is demeaning, because I think there's hardly anything human that's more fundamental. And sometimes, as you know, Rogers would use expressions absolutely abhorred by most of the other schools, such as unconditional positive regard. What a brave man he was. Think saying unconditional positive regard. God damn it. And other times he used the word which is more respectable to my thinner soul. He said, he called it prizing the patient, and the patient prizing the therapist. So those three levels, a good relationship, an understanding, and finally something more precious, prizing. I don't know what you would report or do report if you've already done it, if you review the literature of psychotherapeutic outcome studies and factors thought to be related to successful outcome. And let me repeat in case I didn't say it already, that you remember the outcome studies say 2 things very distinctly. They say a lot of other things, but 2 things they say, I shouldn't say very distinctly, they say it distinctly. One is that psychotherapy helps, and 2, that all psychotherapies help. And they help in about the same measure. There are some codicils to that will, but that's the main thing. And so naturally, we then have to ask, why do they all help? And then we get into the so-called common factors. Because the simplest way of looking at that is that, well, all psychotherapies have certain things in common. They involve a couple of people usually. They involve spending time together. They involve some kind of relationship between the 2 people. And so now we get into these 3 factors that I mentioned. And I suggested that those were the medium of exchange by which the act of courage, or the act of entitlement, to have something of my own psychological reality, those were the conditions which made the transmission of my encouragement, of my entitlement or enfranchisement to the other person, made that possible. And then you remember I added 2 other remarks. One was, well, the dosage is important. We see all around us dangers of misdosage. And again, you see I'm depending on my perhaps increasingly feeble cardiac analogy. But, if you load the person up with a drug, God, you may poison them, right? And you can see what happened recently in Waco, Texas, wherever it was, where a lot of people got loaded up with a certain kind of grandeur and ferocity and got themselves burned up in the process. And that's many examples of that. So it's all very well to encourage people, entitle them, but please keep it to a dull roar. And then, of course, there are many instances, and I practiced partly off them, I think, of people that have not been able to bring enough to it, whose timidity before the patient has kept the patient from making the movements, has reinforced the patient's unentitlement. And then finally, the point I made was about the content of what's transmitted. And this is terribly important, because all this literature can be simply thrown into the wastebasket. Wastebasket. That's what it has been called. The wastebasket of suggestion. Freud was rightly terrified that all his efforts would be put down to suggestion. That he suggested to the patients the ideas. He was he was exquisitely conscious of this debate that is now going on about trauma, for example. Is trauma suggested by the therapists, reinforced by the therapists, or was it there to begin with? And how do you find out? Today we have returned, in my opinion, to a terrible mistake that Freud transcended. Originally he thought he could find out by hypnosis, and then he realized hypnosis is good for putting ideas into your head, but it's very unreliable for getting them out. So he was always conscious that it is true, it is very easy for the therapist to put ideas in the patient's head. Of course, his critics love to say that. Here was this dirty-minded Viennese putting ideas about sexuality into people's minds, even about childhood sexuality. How appalling, they all yelled and screamed. Huh? So he was exquisitely sensitive to the charge that what he was doing was simply suggestion. Just as if you'd heard Judy Herman here not long ago, defending her concern about trauma, which I deeply share with her. She too was afraid. She too heard the call from the other side, the right-wingers in this debate who said, oh, you therapists, you just are against parents, or you're just against this one. You're just pillaring grandparents even now, And so this problem of suggestion is central, and it should be. But notice it's the very problem that we want to have at the center of our work, because it means that people affect each other. It means that people affect each other. And if we didn't have that problem, we wouldn't have our work. But after I've finished with the medium transmission and dosage, I have to come to grips with that too. And you know what I say. I say that when you bring your enthusiasm for the patient's decision to them, you must do it chastely. Chastely. And by that I mean simply that you are not interested. You are not interested in what you think they ought to do. Again, you return to these sentences from Freud or from Binswanger or the example of Conrad and Cezanne, where the artist listens not for what he thinks an apple looks like, but for what the eye gives him in the motif, right? So that when we are trying to give people courage, we must at the same time ourselves practice a terrible humility before our capacity to hear them as opposed to ourselves. Especially because, of course, they may curl up inside us, nest inside us, as we all do to some extent. And we don't even know how they have, co-opted us in the sense of becoming like us, so that when we hear them talk, we are really only hearing ourselves. And remember early on in the discussions I told you, as you perhaps already knew anyway, that a remarkable story